Very good afternoon to all of you. It is my pleasure to invite you to the National Conference on COP27 Compass, Road to Sharm el-Sheikh towards equitable and collective climate action. This policy dialogue is being organized as part of COP27 Compass under Act for Earth initiative of TERI. Before we begin the event proceedings, we request all the speakers to turn on their cameras for a quick photo op. Thank you, everyone. I would request all the speakers to turn on their video when they speak. I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Vibha Dhawan, Director General TERI, to deliver the welcome address. The floor is yours, Dr. Dhawan.
Thank you so much. And it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the National Conference on COP27 Compass titled Road to Sharm el-Sheikh towards equitable and collective climate action. I'd like to thank our partners, that is Bloomberg Philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation, German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection, Tata Chemicals, and Ministry of Environment and Forests for extending their support. And I'll say that they always come forward for cause of this nature. Now, today's session is being organized as part of COP27 Compass of Act for Earth initiative, which was launched in the valedictory session of WSDS World Sustainable Summit 2022. Under this initiative, the two components of COP27 Compass and SDG Charter, TERI is engaging in research activities which will systematically seek to identify and analyze good practices that can be taken up by the governments for climate action and achieve the sustainable development goals. As part of Act for Earth, COP27 Compass seeks to bring forward issues pertinent to Global South, which are also of utmost importance with respect to upcoming UNFCCC COP27. Similarly, through the SDG Charter, TERI is engaging on issues on lifestyles for environment and inclusive energy transition. COP27 will bring together countries, companies, civil societies, and citizens on a common platform to work towards a more sustainable future through adaptation, mitigation, finance, and most importantly, collaboration partnerships. The principles of equity, that's polluter pays, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities outlined in UNFCCC must be cornerstones of success outcome of COP27. The previously concluded COP26 in Glasgow saw progress on adaptation action. This resulted in comprehensive two-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on global goal on adaptation. The global goal on adaptation is also expected to have a high priority at the upcoming COP27. TERI advocates that it is important to have a universal enabling goals that ensure that no one is left behind. Inclusive climate transition needs to be at the heart of policy making, so that in the realm of both adaptation and mitigation measures, there are sufficient safety nets ensuring that no one is left behind. We also need to consider climate action for protecting global commons by signing the various international conventions. Inclusive transitions demand that vulnerable sectors such as agriculture and medium and small enterprises receive the climate finance. Keeping in mind climate responsiveness and sustainable lifestyles, individuals, communities, and organizations should work towards the cause of sustainable development. The National Conference on COP27 Compass will disseminate the messages from COP27 policy briefs and will also seek to facilitate discussions aimed at raising ambition at the national and global level. And I'm sure all of you're being fully involved with COP27 and what all will be discussed over there and countries' papers and so on. There are many more issues that perhaps will be discussed during today's conference. And we are very glad to invite Mr. Iyer, who is the Chief Executive Officer of NITI Aayog, for the leadership address on lifestyles for the environment, or most commonly what is called LIFE. Mr. Iyer is a member of IAS with an illustrious career of over 4 decades. Between 2016 and 2020, he served as Secretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation and pioneered the Swachh Bharat mission, which I should say has become a talk for the country and the way we are moving forward, and internationally also a program which is well appreciated. And I should say it is highly successful as well. And many of our villages, which perhaps haven't even thought about that such a life exists, can exist, they have seen that happening. So thank you, sir, and wish you all the best for this initiative, which is really has shown results perhaps beyond what we expected at the beginning of the program. Mr. Iyer, I would like to highlight that under the Egg for Earth initiative, we are also preparing a policy brief on lifestyle for environment and SDG 12. The brief includes a consumption index for G20 countries, as well as an overview of policy instruments, economic instruments, and social instruments that could promote sustainable lifestyle. TERI strongly advocates for lifestyles from a global south perspective that advocates for both mitigation and adaptation. We strongly believe in the power of consumers who drive demand, and that leads to innovation. And India surely is a country where a lot of innovations have happened and are happening as we talk today. So we are very grateful to you, sir, and we look forward to your address. Thank you once again, and thanks to all the participants. And I wish you good luck to have a productive session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhawan, for the invitation and for also talking about life and sort of setting the context also in the broader sort of context of COP27. And also very glad to see a lot of familiar faces and colleagues who we work with closely, including Atul from UNEP and others. So what I was proposing to do is to talk a little bit about the lifestyle for the environment movement, or LIFE, where a lot of you have been associated with on behalf of NITI, as well as with our very close collaborator, the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. And so what I'll plan to do is to take you through a very short presentation, which builds upon what Dr. Vibha Dhawan spoke about in terms of what is the sort of concept of life and how is it being proposed to take forward as a mission, and how are we proposing to take it forward in terms of implementation on the ground, which is, the highest priority for the Prime Minister. So I've got a little presentation, so if you permit me, I'm going to run that. And can we start the presentation? So what is this life movement or mission? And essentially, we're seeing this, this is being led by the Prime Minister as an Indian-led global mass movement to nudge individual and community action to protect and preserve the environment. That's a sort of broad objective of life. I've got a little video which I wanted to show, which sort of puts it in context. It's in Hindi, so hopefully everyone will follow it. But then I've got a few slides after that. So let's just run the video, which will sort of give you a graphic, understanding of what is life, what are the problems, what are the challenges, and what is the objective of life. Let's run the video.
यह पृथ्वी हमारा घर है। 4.5 अरब साल पुराना यह ग्रह हमारा जीवन दाता भी है और हमारा एकमात्र घर भी। हम मनुष्य इसके 87 लाख जीवों में से बस एक हैं और पिछली कई सदियों में हमने इस ग्रह को ही बदल डाला है। विज्ञान और तकनीकी में हमने महान विकास किया है, जिसका नतीजा है आरामदायक जिंदगी। पर इसकी हमने भरपूर कीमत चुकाई है। प्लास्टिक का प्रकोप गहरे समुद्र से लेकर ऊंचे पर्वत तक दिखता है। अगर हमने प्लास्टिक का प्रयोग कम नहीं किया तो 2050 तक समुद्र में मछलियों से अधिक प्लास्टिक का कचरा होगा। स्थिति हाथ से बाहर जाने को है। हमारा हर कदम, हमारा हर काम आने वाली पीढ़ियों को प्रभावित करेगा। हमारे ग्रह के जीवन में यह एक नाजुक क्षण है और इसलिए हमें सही कदम उठाना ही होगा। विश्व की जटिल समस्याओं के लिए भारत ने सदैव ही नूतन समाधान दिए हैं। सस्टेनेबिलिटी हमारी संस्कृति, परंपरा और जीवन दर्शन का मूल तत्व है। आज भारत विश्व की सस्टेनेबिलिटी खोज की अगुवाई कर रहा है। यह कर्म का क्षण है। पानी का अपव्यय रोकें, गाड़ी का इंजन बंद करें, एक कदम बढ़ाइए रिसाइकलिंग, पोषण और वृद्धि की ओर। घायल धरती के उपचार और नई प्राण वायु के लिए। पर्यावरण की समस्या को बदला जा सकता है। समाधान हमारे ही पास है। हमारे रोजमर्रा के छोटे छोटे कदम हमारी धरती के लिए औषधि बन सकते हैं। प्रो प्लैनेट पीपल बनिए, पर्यावरण सेनानी बनिए।
LIFE यानी लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरमेंट। आज जरूरत है कि हम सभी लोग एक साथ आकर कलेक्टिव पार्टिसिपेशन के साथ लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरमेंट यानी लाइफ को एक अभियान की तरह आगे बढ़ाएं। ये एनवायरमेंटल कॉन्शियस लाइफस्टाइल का एक मास मूवमेंट बन सकता है। आज आवश्यकता है माइंडलेस और डिस्ट्रक्टिव कंजम्पशन के बजाय माइंडफुल और डेलिबरेट यूटिलाइजेशन की। पूरी दुनिया में करोड़ों अरबों लोगों के हर रोज की ये चॉइसेस क्लाइमेट चेंज के खिलाफ लड़ाई को हर दिन बिलियन स्टेप्स आगे ले जाएगी।
Right. So you just saw the Prime Minister articulating the basic concept of life, which is quite simple at one end and actually is very deep at the other. But let me come to the next few slides. Next, please. So, I mean, why is this so important? You know, I mean, all of us intuitively know that the actions we take will make a huge difference in the whole climate and environment protection story. But we have got a couple of facts for you, which many of you would already know. So, you know, this power of collective action is actually hugely impactful. And there's a UNEP study that if only 1/8 of people worldwide were to adopt pro-climate behaviors, as much as 20% of emissions can reduce. You know, these are actions which people can take. And again, you know, just recycling 1 ton of newspaper can avoid 25,000 liters of water use, as well as so much of 3,500 kilograms of landfill, and carpooling, etc. So recycling, all these actions which we can take individually or as communities, they make a huge difference in terms of environment protection, preservation, and specifically impact on climate positive climate action as well. So this is the sort of context in which life is being promoted, lifestyle for the environment, which can make a huge difference. Next, please. Now, so what is mission life? And here are some facts about mission life, and how this is going to be taken forward in the coming weeks and months and years. Next, please. So, recognizing that many countries around the world have taken a lot of action, whether it's in Europe or in East Asia, it's not that, these actions are not taking place, but they're typically taking place either at a community level, maybe at the city level, and in some cases, even at a national level. But this life, as we see it, is the sort of first of its kind. It's dedicated, it's in mission mode, it's got some very specific objectives, it's got a timeline, and it also it's being internationalized or globalized, so that this movement, which is going to be led by India, will actually bring many other countries on board to join this global campaign, and sort of highlight how individual and community behaviors can be at the center of the climate action. So while all the debate is taking place, like in COP26, and it will take place in COP27, and we can take all these discussions forward, the North and the South and all the contentious issues. In the meanwhile, India is moving forward by acting on climate change through people. That's a key message. Next, please. So this is being seen as a India-led global Jan Andolan, a people's movement, to trigger some simple actions that will resonate across the world, right? So these are actions which anyone can take anywhere, more or less, to protect the environment. And the idea is that the actions would be relatable across India and global populations, cause no negative impact on economic activity. That's very important. And in fact, can stimulate growth and jobs. So it's important to understand that, as SDG 12 says, it's about responsible production and consumption. It's not about decreasing consumption in any way. And it's about nudging. It's about how can you sort of trigger behavior change, like India's experience in many other programs, including the Swachh Bharat mission, which was referred to, but also the Give It Up campaign for cooking gas cylinders, the Jal Jeevan mission, which is another people's movement. So there's a lot of experience in India, particularly over the last 6 to 8 years, of how people have come forward and taken action in their own hands and sort of become accountable for it, for delivering it. But Mission Life will also, in addition to the mass movement of 1 billion people plus, will also leverage existing institutions and resources of government. So many of the ongoing government programs in different ministries at central and state level, they will again be leveraged to promote life. So it will be a kind of whole of government, whole of India approach in villages, in urban local bodies, in schools, in colleges, in other institutions. So the idea is how can everyone come on board so that it becomes a true mass movement, and then how it can influence and trigger similar actions at scale in other countries. Next, please. Now, these are some very simple sample life actions. And we have a list of 75 actions in our 75th year of independence. And the document and other guidelines will be released soon. But these are just some simple actions which all of us, in fact, practice on a day-to-day basis. But we need to get everyone to sort of practice these. So instead of using a plastic bag, why not use a cloth bag? And why do we let the taps run while brushing our teeth or hand washing? I mean, it's very, very simple, right? It sounds very basic, but many of us don't do it. And these are some of the actions which can be taken. They figure in that list of 75, which will be shared in a couple of weeks with everyone. Can we go to the next? Now, what is the big picture of life? And I'm going to stop here. Go to the next slide. Let's understand this, right? So this is about changing behavior and nudging behavior towards, lifestyle environment and climate-friendly lifestyle behaviors and actions. But that in turn is going to trigger a supply response. So from the bottom up, while all the big discussions are being taken globally in terms of supply and policy, the idea is that they will have to respond to demand. And so there can be bottom-up pressure, which is happening around the world, but this is going to be on a very large scale. And so then there'll be a policy response as well. So these are all, initially the idea is to sort of trigger behavior change at a people community level, and then there'll be a supply response to that. The market will respond, the policy response, and all this is not linear. Basically, they go on in parallel as well. And let me also mention here, as many of you know, India is perhaps the first country in the world which has included lifestyle for the environment in its NDCs. And this was approved by the cabinet in August. So it's actually figures at that level, at a policy level, that lifestyle for the environment is something which the country intends to implement, as opposed to just debate. So it's very much the Prime Minister's vision of having action on the ground, having people commit to and implementing this and owning it. So that's how we see life. In the coming days and weeks, you'll see much more information about this in terms of the campaign, how it will be communicated, how it will be implemented, how it will be monitored. So there's much more to come. This was just a little preview of mission life, and it will also figure in the G20 debate in the different working groups. So this is going to be a whole of government, whole of country approach, and a lot of this will be shared between the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change and Niti Aayog as we move forward. So thank you for listening patiently. I don't know what's the next step on this, but if there are any quick questions, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if there are any comments or suggestions or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Iyer. Now I invite Dr. Shelly Kedia, Senior Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development Research and Leadership, TERI, to give the presentation on TERI study. Over to you, Dr. Kedia.
Thank you so much, Rumpa. I will just be sharing my screen. Can you please confirm if you can see my screen? Rumpa?
Not yet. Not yet.
Can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you so much for confirming. Greetings to all of you. Many thanks for joining us for the virtual conference on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh towards equitable and collective climate actions. I would like to begin by communicating that this conference is being organized under the Act for Earth initiative that was launched at the WSDS 2022 valedictory session. The objective of Act for Earth is to drive ambitious and urgent actions on climate change and sustainable development through means of research and dialogue, and also bring out the Global South perspective. Considering that we are already in the critical decade of action, the Act for Earth initiative has two components, which is the COP27 Compass and SDG Charter. The COP27 Compass will look at climate negotiations and climate action from a global commons perspective, and the SDG Charter will look at inclusive energy transitions in SDG 7, along with lifestyles for environment and SDG 12. Apart from the global deliberations around the UNFCCC processes, Act for Earth initiative will also seek to advocate for normative shifts in intergovernmental forums such as the G20, for which India is due to assume the presidency in December this year. We would like to acknowledge our partners who've supported WSDS and Act for Earth related activities. We would like to thank the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. We would also like to thank funding support received from Bloomberg Philanthropies, Rockefeller Foundation, German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection under the International Climate Initiative, IKI, as well as Tata Clean Tech Finance for this support. The 4 policy briefs that are being prepared has mobilized the efforts of 23 researchers across various disciplines from TERI under the guidance of several senior colleagues. Coming to the science, as we head towards Sharm el-Sheikh, the message from science is clear. We are running out of time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has underscored the need for immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions. Global GHG emissions are projected to peak between 2020 and latest before 2025 in the model pathways that look at limiting the temperature that limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So we are really like sort of running out of time, and that is something that cannot be emphasized enough. The estimated remaining carbon budget and the time from the beginning of 2020 could be as little as 7.5 years. And according to the Climate Action Tracker, the NDC and updated targets that were announced at COP26, even if fully implemented, would at most limit global warming to 2.4 degrees Celsius, well above both the Paris temperature goals. So, has the global community really kept the 1.5 degrees goal alive? Or has the global climate regime failed us? The highest, if you look at per capita CO2 emissions for G20, and this slide is only showing this for G20 countries and the EU, the highest per capita emitters among G20 countries include Saudi Arabia, Australia, and United States. United States, for instance, has a per capita emissions of 60 tons, which is more than thrice of the world average. India's per capita emissions are less than half the world average and lowest among the G20 countries. This figure depicts the cumulative CO2 emissions for for G20 countries and the EU 27 in terms of the percentage share of the world. The total cumulative emissions at the world level are 1.7 trillion tons. In terms of cumulative emissions, United States has the highest share of more than 24% with 417 gigatons. And the EU countries rank second, followed by China and Russia. So what are the key issues for COP27 and beyond? Science has clearly highlighted the urgency to act to achieve the Paris temperature goals. The challenge is achieving the twin goals of climate action and equity. This challenge is also further amplified considering the conflict situation concerning Russia and Ukraine, which has further brought to light the vulnerabilities when it comes to energy security as well as food security. The other aspect is there is a need to act at all levels, national jurisdictions, but also outside national jurisdictions, and that's why the aspect of global commons becomes important. There is also need to act at subnational levels, ecosystem levels, communities, as well as at the individual level. Now, coming to the issue of climate finance. The moral compass has not moved in the right direction so far. The $100 billion promise has not been realized. As of now, the climate finance remains disproportionately allocated towards mitigation actions, and hopefully the expectation from the process of new collective quantified goal should be that it should be able to bridge the gap and ensure that there is more climate finance flowing for adaptation action. Also, the long-term finance process, which is aimed at progressing on mobilization and scaling up of climate finance, including from resources originating from public as well as private sources. Also, it is important that there are limits to markets. So let's look at the limitations of markets when it especially comes to leveraging public finance to mobilize more private finance for adaptation actions. Moreover, climate finance needs to take a targeted approach, which needs to benefit not just countries, but actually vulnerable people, communities, and sectors. For example, the agriculture sector, also the MSME sector. In terms of the global goal and adaptation, just like the way when the discussion around the global SDG goals were on, the global goal and adaptation must be a SMART goal, which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. An important outcome of COP27 could be that the global community commits to securing basic universal enablers of adaptation at all scales. For example, universal access to early warning systems and climate informations. This could enable adaptation behavior as well as mitigation behaviors. Also, global goal on adaptation must be country-driven, but also locally validated, considering that adaptation actions are context-specific. And all kinds of indicators must be considered, including input indicators that pertain to climate finance, output indicators, which are the actual systems or policies, as well as the outcome indicators that pertain to adaptation. For the loss and damage agenda to evolve, there is a need to undertake assessments of loss and damage in terms of needs, gap, and barriers. And these need to be owned and led by countries to ensure that the context specificity is adequately covered. There is also need to include more actors from the global south when we talk about OBNEs or organizations, bodies, and network. And in particularly, there needs to be representation from the most vulnerable communities. There is a need to take a risk mitigation approach and explore innovative instruments such as insurance. When it comes to global stocktake, the principle of equity and transparency is key and must be recognized in each sphere of action. The provision of finance to be articulated in GST needs to be dedicatedly represented, and climate finance should be the heart and soul of GST and must be reported at the disaggregated levels of mitigation, adaptation, as well as hopefully loss and damage. There is a need to provide support to the global south for data collection as well as technical assessments that pertain to the global stocktake process. The annual ocean and climate dialogues, as mandated by the COP26 outcomes, must ensure participation and inclusion of all stakeholders. The Global Commons lens is important to promote governance from an Earth systems perspective. And there is also need for definite goals, targets, and indicators beyond what is already covered under SDG 14 that pertain to life below water. There is also need to strengthen international coordination and integration of ocean observations and collection of ocean data. Now, coming to lifestyles for environment, and we had Mr. Iyer give an excellent overview of India's thinking behind life. And we hope to also hear more from Mr. Bagai of UNEP on this. But lifestyle from environment from a global south perspective should consider both adaptation as well as mitigation behaviors. Metrics on lifestyle and sustainable consumption need to be developed and applied. For instance, even in the current global indicator frameworks on SDG 12, do not focus enough on downstream segment of resource value chain, especially the retail consumer, and this needs to address. Also, policy instruments such as eco-labeling can be considered. There is a need to deploy all types of instruments, and we did this analysis for the G20 countries. And also, like Mr. Iyer highlighted, that there are efforts, but these are mostly fragmented, siloed efforts, and this needs to be upscaled further. Also, India is a young country and can be a role model for demand-driven innovations for sectors including transport, residential sector, food, and waste management. Normative leadership through the G20 forum can nudge countries to adopt a variety of instruments for sustainable lifestyles. And perhaps, since advertisement, the advertisement sector is a very influential sector, there is also a need to nudge them and perhaps form a coalition on sustainable lifestyle and responsible advertisement. In terms of just transitions, now this is really like, even if you look at the COP27 Presidency's website, this is one of the mandates. And in a recent visit by the COP27 high-level champions, he also highlighted there is a need to develop metrics for just transition. Overall, if we look at the discourse, just transitions has gained discursive traction, especially when it comes to energy supply and fossil fuels. However, dimensions of inclusion in sectors such as MSMEs, agriculture, and transport have not received adequate attention in the dominant discourses, especially when we're talking about climate action and climate-related transitions. Yes, supply segments have people and technologies, but demand segments have a larger implication for people and as stakeholders who would be impacted by climate action and who can in fact even contribute to climate solutions. The study also found that there is a gap when it comes to gender disaggregated data on clean energy and climate transitions, including for adaptation. And especially especially when it comes to demand side sectors of agriculture, MSMEs, as well as transport. Now, this is the final slide, as has also been outlined in the concept notes, the guiding questions are on the topics of global goal on adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage, global stocktake, global commons in climate action, lifestyle for environment, as well as the normative influence of G20. With this, I'd like to hand over the screen back to Rumpa. Rumpa, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kedia. Now we will have a panel discussion with sector experts moderated by Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, Distinguished Fellow Emeritus TERI. I will request Ambassador Dasgupta to take over the discussions from here.
Thank you. COP27 will convene at a difficult juncture. At the previous COP in Glasgow, countries pledged themselves to hasten the transition to cleaner fuels. However, during the past year, we have seen a number of developed countries take a huge step backwards. They have moved on to more carbon-intensive fuels, including coal. Now, this, of course, was for reasons which could not have been foreseen at Glasgow, and therefore we need not go into the rights and wrongs of the decision. But it is important for us to know that this step adds hugely to the already heavy burdens of poor countries in respect to adaptation. And it therefore highlights the need for stepping up financial support, particularly support in the form of grants or concessional finance for developing countries. It also highlights the importance of proceeding with our work solidly on the basis of the principle of equity. As Dr. Dhawan emphasized in her opening presentation, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities should be the cornerstone of our work at Sharm el-Sheikh. My colleague, Shelley, Dr. Kedia, also emphasized the need for basing our work on the global stocktake solidly on the basis of the principle of equity. With these few opening remarks, I will now invite the first speaker on our list of distinguished panelists to make his presentation, Mr. Atul Bagai, Country Director, India for UNEP. Mr. Bagai.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I also welcome Ambassador Manjeev and all panelists in this very important webinar that is being organized, and it's set the tempo with a very nice presentation by Param, CEO Niti Aayog. There are a set of questions that Shelley was referring to, and I thought I will talk very briefly on some of those questions which have been highlighted, and also try to bring out certain aspects of the road to Sharm el-Sheikh. I was also in Bonn last 3 months on some personal emergency, but it gave me an opportunity to interact very closely with the hierarchy in the Climate Change Secretariat and also talk to some of the countries as some subsidiary body meetings were being held. And there are two aspects I just wanted to highlight, some of the gleanings from my conversations, and they're very surprising gleanings. The common consensus there in Bonn was that Sharm el-Sheikh COP may not be a very important COP because most of the things have been already agreed to, and it's not going to be a very dynamic or a robust kind of COP. And the second gleaning I could make out was that there was a lot of focus on mitigation. It also can be seen in the institutional structure that the Secretariat has and the committees that have been formed, with not that much of an emphasis on adaptation, whereas clearly adaptation from a developing country perspective is also so very important and has been talked about so much in the past meetings. Coming to the first point, and Shelley in her very good presentation has highlighted some very contentious issues which have not been resolved as yet. And I don't see any reason why Sharm el-Sheikh should be seen as just a COP where probably not much needs to be achieved. Of course, Sharm el-Sheikh should and would take the conversation forward on loss and damages or on the issues of finance, which I feel is the most contentious issue on the table right now. The global stock take or the global goal on adaptation. A lot of these issues will be taken forward. But I wanted to highlight the fact that the developed countries need to really, as Ambassador Dasgupta was saying in his opening statement, need to see that it is not what the developing countries should be doing to achieve their NDCs, but how the developed countries need to also look at what they are doing. An example from Ambassador Dasgupta was just a tip of the iceberg, I suppose. So I think from that whole common but differentiated responsibilities, there needs to be a real transparent and soul-searching kind of a conversation with the developed countries on what they need to do and how they need to fulfill the responsibilities they have, and the financing responsibility certainly being the main area of work. I have Montreal Protocol regime for almost 21 years. Would like to highlight one aspect of international governance, environmental governance, where we have a very excellent, well thought out, well implemented institutional mechanism for meeting environmental goals. There are institutional mechanisms to assess what kind of cost is required for developing countries to phase out their use of ozone depleting substances, for example. There's a whole scientific backing to that exercise. There's a whole economic backing to that exercise. Of course, it's a very minuscule part of the whole climate change sectors, but there is a good institutional mechanism that is available for all of us to look at and to see how it can be adapted for financing the climate change issues. And finally, my last point at this stage I would like to highlight is what Param started on life, and I'm very happy. TERI also organized recently a very good event on life, and I think most of the UN organizations also right now are now trying to work out how they can support the life campaign of the Prime Minister, which increasingly is also becoming a very important element of G20. We just had a very detailed conversation with the Ministry of External Affairs yesterday in terms of what is the global vision that India has of scaling up life campaign, not only in India, but in the 197 countries in the world. And I think that important environmental leadership is very, very important in terms of seeing while these contentious issues are being debated and reach an agreement. I think this part of individual behavior can certainly be very, very important step. And I think it also drives forcefully the philosophy that Gandhiji had laid out, that I would like to live simply so that others can simply live. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagai, for your important remarks, particularly on why Sharm el-Sheikh should be an important step forward, and also for your very perceptive remarks on the importance of the LIFE program in the work of the conference. I now call upon Dr. Navroz Dovash, professor at the Center for Policy Research, to give us the benefit of his remarks. Dr. Dovash is the coordinating lead author of IPCC 6, and he's also one of the principal persons driving India's low carbon strategy. He's made very important academic and practical contributions in this work. So, Dr. Dovash, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dasgupta, and thank you also for that generous introduction. And thanks to TERI colleagues for inviting me. I've already profited from the discussions so far. I'll try and be brief with just 3 or 4 points. The first is that while I agree that we should not have a sense of fatalism about the COP27 going in, I think it is worth having a sense of realism and a acknowledgement that the background conditions for this COP are extremely fraught. Global attention is, of course, very divided with the action in Russia and Ukraine. Europe is completely occupied by its energy security crisis that Ambassador Dasgupta talked about, which has led to countries like England and Germany allocating 5% of their budget, or 5% of GDP essentially, to fossil fuel subsidies. This is after successive G20s have called for a reduction in fossil fuel subsidies. It's of course pitched as a short-term measure, but one has to ask, what are the measures that will make sure it remains short-term? We have growing macroeconomic instability. The recent episode with the UK bond markets is an indication of this. My apologies, I don't have full control over my dog. So this is a further issue. And to the extent that, in recent CPR dialogues, we had a speaker, Adam Tooze, describe a world in the midst of polycrisis, which is a very evocative word for where we are. So in all of this, what can we concretely expect? This is being pitched as the loss and damage COP. We have Pakistan, which has recently suffered really a climate catastrophe, and it's hard to imagine it's not substantially exacerbated by climate change, as the chair of the G77 and China. So undoubtedly, they will be pushing hard on this agenda. I think it's very important for India to think about whether and how we will be supporting Pakistan on this. I think there's scope to actually, if there's a slight silver lining here, is there's scope for India to really play a role in bringing South Asia together as a cogent voice. The South Asian region is a cogent voice backing Pakistan on the loss and damage issue. So there's scope really here for regional action. But wiser minds than I will have to figure out what exactly we have to ask for. And Ambassador Dasgupta, I think, is among those minds who knows this process inside out. Are there particular procedural hooks that we need to seed in Sharm el-Sheikh to make sure the loss and damage agenda actually carries forward and becomes a wedge that we can later on leverage open into a set of issues? We do have comments from people like the UN Secretary General calling for a windfall tax on fossil fuels. And this brings me to a larger point. I think we're at the moment in the global climate debate now where there's lots of appetite to join together seemingly disparate issues. We've heard many times over the years a Tobin tax, a tax on transactions, on financial transactions being harnessed for climate change. There's talk of harnessing private capital from the pension, US and other large country pension funds. I think that, we in India are justifiably concerned about the finance agenda. So I'm just going to bridge the finance story, both on the mitigation side as well as the adaptation and loss and damage side. But I think we have to come up with much more concrete suggestions of what exactly it is that we want to see on the table. And we need to use equity, in the words of a paper my colleague Lavanya Rajamani once wrote, as a sword rather than as a shield. What is it that we actually want to extract by noting the fact that the rich world has actually occupied the carbon space? I think we have a political moment in India where we are committed to a low carbon transition. We are committed to low carbon transition, but at our pace and based on our needs, which I think is the right approach to take. But let's turn that into a set of very clear and concrete requests for finance. And if I have a bit of a criticism about our approach so far, we throw out big numbers, unitary big numbers, uncited, unsubstantiated, and that doesn't give enough of a sense of how we would use that money and exactly how we can then bring about that, use that money to leverage action. So a concrete ask on loss and damage, concrete story on finance, given the fact that we are in this moment, this moment of polycrisis. An opportunity to bring together South Asia around the climate vulnerability agenda, and in a sense, repair some bridges with other vulnerable countries who sometimes have seen India as being more focused on asserting control over energy rather than addressing questions of vulnerability. And then the fourth point I will make is one around life. I think that it's really interesting that we are trying to, as a nation and, fronted in a sense by the Prime Minister himself, tell a narrative about a social movement globally. I see scope to strengthen that story a little bit by talking not just about individual behavior change. Of course, individual behavioral change is at the core, but individuals are more likely to change behaviors when they're supported by infrastructure and incentives to do so. So we should be actually converting the life story into a much bigger story, which is, and tying it to finance. So how does South Asia, Africa build cities, for example, that encourage mobility that is non-vehicular, that is non-motorized? How do we build our infrastructure in ways that do this? How do we lock in buildings that are suitable for passive rather than active cooling? All of that also takes money. But by doing that, we're locking in low carbon trajectories and locking out high carbon ones for multiple decades. I think the life agenda can be actually leveraged into a life supported by suitable infrastructure agenda. It's much less catchy, I realize, but then academics are not great at coming up with slogans. That's then for somebody else. But I think that we could actually go further with the life agenda. So let me just close there, and apologies, Ambassador, I've taken too much time. And over to you and Mr. Puri.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dabash. I'm not going to summarize your main points because you have done it yourself very effectively. I now request the next speaker on the list, Mr. Chandra Bhushan, Chief Executive Officer of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. Mr. Chandra Bhushan.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Ambassador Manjeev, TERI, for inviting me. There are many things that I'm going to repeat what Navroz said because those are important points to reiterate. But before I do that, I think let me start with what Atul said. The general perception that things have been settled at COP26 and that we do not have much to do at COP27 will come as a big disappointment to people in Africa and Asia who want to make COP27 a loss and damage COP. Everyone is talking about COP27 as an African COP, a COP where we will get some outcome on loss and damage, though John Kerry has very specifically in his recent remark said that US cannot do things in few weeks. Nevertheless, I think if developed countries are going with a mindset that we don't have much to do at COP27, this is going to be a failed COP in any case, because the other side is prepared to demand much more and is expecting much more. Now, while it is an African COP, I think I'll pick up what Ambassador Dasgupta said, that this also has to be a developed countries COP. They have put us on back foot for a long time. They come up with agenda. For example, at COP26, it was net zero, it was methane, it was just transition. They came out with multiple agenda and they put us on our table to respond. I think COP27 has to be a COP where we put agenda for them to respond. Whether it is with respect to fossil fuel subsidies, their reluctance to deal with massive transition that is required in developed world to decarbonize their economy. Those are important questions that we must be prepared when we go to Sharm el-Sheikh. And I'm hopeful that the Indian delegation will be prepared for these hard questions. Agenda, a positive agenda, nevertheless, not a negative sense, but an agenda to demand change in the developed world itself. And we must be prepared for that. It should not be an accusatory stance, but a positive conversation on, while they're questioning us on how we want to change is an important question, and we respect and we will respond to that question. They should also respond to our question on how they plan to change themselves, not only in short term, because everything they are doing, they are pinning it on short term, crisis that they are facing right now, but also in long term. There hasn't been a significant change in the energy and industrial infrastructure of developed world for a long time. And how they are going to make that changes in next 10, 15 years is something that we must get clarity on. And that's where also global stocktake becomes important. Dr. Kedia said that stocktake should be only about finance, should be focused on finance. I think it should also be focused on honest discussion on system change that is required. Finance is important from our side. We would like to get much more transparency on finance. But I think we should also get much more transparency on how other countries are planning to make systematic changes that is required for large-scale transition. The other point I would like to make here is that Pakistan is not only going to be leading G77 plus China, it is also going to be co-chair. The latest news is that Egypt has asked Pakistan to co-chair the COP. And if that news is correct, then in that case, we have to make sure that this COP doesn't become a regional COP between a South Asia COP. And that we set aside regional issue and we work as South Asia, as a solidarity with Pakistan, as developing countries together, as global South together, to look at important issues that matter to us. So I'm reiterating what Navroz said, but this is a very important point to keep in mind as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh. The last point that I would like to make is actually 2 points. Let me start with life. For the first time, I have heard with so much clarity what the government is thinking about life. I had read about it, but the clarity was not there. But first of all, I think it is an important campaign. India is going out with a message that individual action is important. But I don't think that the message that we can continue increasing our consumption and solve the environmental problem is the right message, or that there will be no effect on our economy and we can solve all climate and environmental problem. I think efficiency is not sufficiency. We understand for a long time. That has been a major criticism of SDG 12 of the UN. SDG 12 is all about efficiency. It doesn't talk about sufficiency. So going to the developed world with a life campaign saying that you can continue consuming, make minor changes in your lifestyle, and we will solve the climate crisis is probably not the right message to give. And this message has to be much more nuanced. While it is true for the poor consumption has to go up, I think the rich consumption has to go down. And therefore, a uniform message that do these 75 and we will solve the problem may not be the right message to give. You will have a bandwagon the whole bandwagon coming on this, and you might not get what you want. So I believe that the message of life has to be much more nuanced for developed and developing countries. Because today in developed countries, there is serious research on degrowth. And I think it is an important research. The very assumption that we all can have the best win-win, where we can continue consuming and solve all the problems with technology, is a myth. And that myth making is not going to last a lot. So as far as life is concerned, and that's the message for UN itself. As I said, SDG 12 is probably the weakest sustainable development goal. Because the indicators are weak. They are only about efficiency. They don't talk about sufficiency. The last point I would like to make is that there is discussion between G7 and India on just energy transition deal. While I do not know much about the details of the deal, my only hope is that we do not do what South Africa did at Glasgow, which do a hurried deal without understanding the consequences of that deal. And South Africans are lamenting that deal today because they now realize that what they have promised they cannot deliver with the funding that they asked at COP26. So I think we have to understand what just energy transition will mean and entail for us, rather than thinking about energy transition as only a labor issue, which is what developed world thinks about. So I will end my interventions and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandrabhushan, for those very, very important remarks that you've made. Very cogent, very briefly and effectively put forward. And in particular, you're emphasizing the importance for our taking the initiative and not simply playing a defensive role. Thank you very much. I now call upon the next speaker on the list, Dr. Archana Negi, Associate Professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi.
Good afternoon. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Right. So good afternoon, Ambassadors Dasgupta, Ambassador Puri, and thank you, TERI, as usual, for having me here. Starting with the disclaimer that I had occasion to speak just a few weeks back. So my apologies to everyone who will have to suffer the overlap if you were already here. My complaint to the organizers is, of course, where I'm placed, because you've already heard everything, all the interventions that had to be made. So please forgive me if there are repetitions, etc. There are, of course, much better placed people to speak about the issues on the agenda of Sharm el-Sheikh. But since the topic is phrased as, on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh and coming from international relations, I will take benefit and also focus on what will happen in and around Sharm el-Sheikh. So not just focusing on the agenda items, although I had a section on that, but I will reduce that a little bit and speak a little bit more in detail about the context of Sharm el-Sheikh. As I said, I spoke about this before, but I think it's important that at least 3 different contexts be kept in mind when we are, seeking to assess what is going to happen at Sharm el-Sheikh. One is, of course, the natural and environmental sort of context, the backdrop in which the conference is being held, which very, very clearly emphasizes that the problem of climate change is worsening and time is running out, right? Time for fixing the problem is running out. We have no better example than the summer of 2022. I need not go into the details. We've all been with it, with the press reports of, the warmest temperatures on record. Also in the global north, aspects like new issue areas like failed harvests, heat stress, etc. Closer home, the Pakistan floods were mentioned before, and these have been devastating with the toll crossing 1,400 and over 33 million people impacted. At least those are the figures that are out there. The Pakistan case is also an important, example that flags the equity question, because you have a country here that is responsible for less than 1% of global GHG emissions, finding itself on 8th rank in the list of countries that are most vulnerable to extreme weather events. So this just links back to the equity question that the Global South must take to not just COP27, but all subsequent COPs. To more examples, but just read out one very interesting description which sums it all up as far as the current year is concerned, which said, quote, "There's an old joke about the fellow who has his left foot in a bucket of ice water and the right in a bucket of boiling water, so that his overall temperature is average." That seems to apply to the climate during 2022's Northern Summer of Extremes. And this is Kevin Trenberth writing for The Conversation. The second sort of context is a little, more interesting, the locational context of COP27. And again, this has been mentioned before that COP27, will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, under the slogan "Together for Implementation." This is only the 5th time. So 4 times before, climate conferences have been held in Africa, but that's not such a big number given the vulnerability of the continent. If you look at the Global Climate Risk Index of 2021, you have countries like Mozambique and Zimbabwe featuring as countries affected most by the extreme weather events in 2019. So like it was mentioned before, the conference is being billed as this African COP, not just with reference to the location, but also in the expectation that, African interests as countries particularly exposed and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change will be brought center stage. This is also the first of 2 COPs in the region, in the what is called as the MENA, the Middle East and North African region, as COP28 is slated for or scheduled to be held in the UAE. The broader questions of this locational context, right? It has been mentioned, of course, that this will impact the issues that may be in focus. For example, adaptation, financing for adaptation. These could be issues that will be particularly underscored in COP27. But let me also bring, into the conversation another side of this locational context. So an important implication of the location of COP27 is also to do with actors in the conference, right? So civil society participation in the conference. Environmentalists who were interviewed across this region, across the MENA, they have expressed concerns about the location of the COP in Egypt, right? One report claims, and please allow me to read just a little part which is very interesting. It says, quote, "Cairo has crushed independent civil society and its security services aren't likely to look kindly on these organizations, embarrassing them in front of the world's media. Egyptian organizations, non-governmental organizations, are particularly cash-strapped due to bans on foreign funding. That uncertainty has been compounded by the nature of Sharm el-Sheikh, a heavily securitized resort with one major road in and out, easily policed spaces, and apparently hotels that are required to charge rates that might push the entire COP beyond some organizations' means, particularly those from poorer countries. 2-star hotels must charge no less than $120 per night during the conference, a big increase from normal rates and a move that casts doubt on the Egyptian government's desire to incorporate civil society or poorer states in general. Activists are also primed for astroturfed protests, quote unquote, in which state-affiliated NGOs demonstrate near the convention center to deliver the impression of an independent local civil society. This is Peter Schwartzstein writing for the Wilson Center. Other than this concern about participation of non-state actors, also about issues, right? A further implication of the location of the conference may manifest as a downgrading of certain topics. Fossil fuels, for example, right, will be a particularly sensitive topic. given the divisions between the energy-producing Gulf states who dominate the Arab climate group, non-producers across the global south, and Cairo's desire to prevent those tensions from spilling into the open, unquote. So in many different ways, the location of COP27 could also be impacted by the fact of where it is planned to be held, and not just the fact that it's an African COP, but also there are other implications of holding it there. And one is reminded of what happened after the famous battle at Seattle in the context of trade negotiations, when the COP was shifted to Doha for very similar reasons. But I'll stop there as far as that is concerned. The third and last context is the geopolitical context in which COP is taking place. And like the chair mentioned, COP26 took place amidst very, very unstable conditions. There was the backdrop of the pandemic. Those uncertainties remain. But what has been added is the additional layer of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has obviously led to disruptions in any attempted collaborations. And as far as climate change is concerned, there are at least two very important implications. One is, of course, the impact of the war playing out in the context of food and energy insecurity and increased prices, etc. This whole focus on the economy, which takes attention away and priority away from climate change as an issue of concern. And the second is also to do with the G20, right? That as a group, which can play a very important role in climate action, has been destabilized to the extent of members not being willing to talk to each other or speak to each other, given the context of the war. There is also Taiwan, etc., which have led to a breakdown in climate accords, etc. So in brief, basically climate diplomacy, which is a cooperative mechanism, right? And the success of COP27 is contingent upon goodwill. This is something which is a very, very scarce resource as we move into Sharm el-Sheikh, and the current geopolitical context has very, very frequently, including in the UN General Assembly, been described as a very tense background. So whatever takes place at Sharm el-Sheikh will be impacted by the dynamics amongst these three background contexts, the natural environmental one, the locational one, and also the geopolitical one. Now, very briefly at Sharm el-Sheikh, the agenda at Sharm el-Sheikh is very heavy, although we tend to focus more on, these key aspects. We talk about mitigation, adaptation, etc. But there are the 5 concurrent negotiation streams, which will cover the UNFCCC, second, the subsidiary body for implementation, or the SBI, the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice, or the SUBSTA of the UNFCCC, and the 2 agreements within the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So it is important that track be kept across negotiations in these tracks. The IISD's categorization of the agenda items is very useful to understand what will be discussed at Sharm el-Sheikh. And they talk about, one, the standing and regularly recurring items. And the second is the issues which are carrying over from the previous meetings, such as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Then there are the relatively new issues. And last, some country coalitions have suggested for inclusion certain issues. And these would largely be the 4 categories that are discussed at Sharm el-Sheikh. I had put down 5 issues that I briefly wanted to discuss, but I think I'll skip that, given that this may take too much time. On mitigation, very briefly, COP26 did see this ambition-raising function of mitigation, and from the global South perspective, it will be imperative, to pursue the implementation concerns that carry over from the previous years of the climate regime. Especially, and as has been mentioned by several others, to insist upon the differentiated part of the CBDR principle, continued implementation of mitigation targets by the developed countries will need to underlie every other aspect of climate negotiations. Adaptation is by itself, going to be one of the Global South concerns. And by way of, recommendation for the Global South, adaptation should be the key push area for COP27. And it needs to be articulated, I submit, in a manner that is much wider than simply the question of finance. The issue needs to also consider other aspects of transfer of technology, know-how, etc. Third, the question of finance can, of course, be broken down into various different aspects that are going to be put up, depending on which ones do come up on the agenda. And for the Global South, it will be, many speakers have referred to this before, it will be imperative to pursue in COP27 negotiations on each of the finance-related items, and in particular, the one relating to loss and damage, which is, the fourth issue area. Loss and damage, bringing it and keeping it on the agenda, but equally importantly, initiating studies, making it an issue that becomes, acceptable, more acceptable in the climate negotiations is something that the South has to push for. And like has been mentioned before, a proactive agenda rather than a reactive one coming from the South will be something that that will benefit the Global South. On global stocktake, the last sort of issue, this is already on, it initiated since Glasgow. From the Global South, coming directly to the recommendation, I would submit that making use of the provision of the thematic analysis is of particular importance to the Global South, especially drawing on themes such as agriculture, food security, health, etc., because focusing on the thematic inputs would lead to more actionable outcomes as far as policy is concerned. This would also involve civil society, etc. Last 2 points, which were part of the questions, but the global commons, bringing it into climate change, extremely important. We did have a more detailed discussion on this in the previous panel, but just very quick references that climate change is not an issue that can be resolved or addressed only within the climate change track. One of the examples I like to quote very much is the one from ozone, and the ozone regime was mentioned before, the Kigali Amendment, which takes place within the ozone regime and yet is seen as one of the most effective ways of addressing climate change. And also the ongoing negotiations on global commons in the context of oceans. So bringing together, these two aspects of the global commons is extremely important. My assessment is that often there is a lot of talk about linking climate change to other issue areas in international relations like development or human rights or security. But what is lost is that climate change is enmeshed within a whole lot of other environmental issues as well, and that should not be lost sight of. Last is the role of G20, and I believe that G20 can. Again, there's been a lot of talk that India, as under its presidency, the G20 should take far more action as far as climate is concerned. My core message there is that one thing that the G20 will need to do is lead by example. And this is something which at the moment is not working out for the G20. There is a report that was published earlier this year which assessed the climate commitments of the G20 countries themselves and did not come out with very happy results as far as what the G20 themselves were doing. So one is, of course, upping the game as far as they themselves are concerned. And the second is the leading by normative example. So, for instance, institutionalizing the principle of equity within the functioning of the G20, etc. And of course, there's much more to be said. So I'll stop by saying that the road to Sharm el-Sheikh is part of a much longer road. We are on a milestone year. This is the 30 years since the adoption of the UNFCCC. Let me remind you about the Berlin mandate at COP1 And if you read the text of what the Berlin mandate said, it's really not very different from what we are doing now. Only the level of urgency has gone up. So at some point, the stock take has to also be about the regime itself, that 27 COPs down the line or 30 years down the line, how much of it has been worth it in the context of pursuing certain objectives. I will stop there, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you very much for your indulgence, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negi, for that thought-provoking and comprehensive presentation. I now have the pleasure of calling on our next panelist, a friend from Pakistan, Ms. Kashmala Kakakhel, climate finance specialist and former member of the Executive Committee of the Green Climate Fund, to make a presentation. Ms. Kakakhel.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I really appreciate TERI for inviting me to this very interesting conversation that we've been having. And I appreciate the kind words that have been said about the situation that Pakistan has been facing for a problem that we have very little to do with. So thank you very much. Heartfelt appreciation from across the border. Thank you very much. I'd just like to sort of, before we get to the COP itself, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to put in place in context where we were last time and what the problem was at COP26 and where we are and what the problem is now outside the COP. So last time it was the pandemic. What that actually exposed us to the reality was how fragile our entire financial system is, how it came crumbling down because of one external issue. And we realized how exposed our climate agreements, global climate agreements were in the face of such calamities, where we were so agnostic to some of these external changes that happen in the world and so rapidly that we were struggling to sort of countries were saying, look, we have financial crunches, and there was all this conversation around how funding to climate change is in question because of the pandemic, etc. And then it has these longer term impacts on its financial systems. And this year, lo and behold, it's the Ukraine war. And we have the countries in the West sort of using that as a specific reason for why they're facing what they're facing at the moment. And therefore, what that is now exposing to us, the fact that when we set up these climate agreements, they were not set for times of war. They were really set in for times of peace, where we didn't really put in perspective, or we didn't have the lens of what will happen if status quo does not go forward as within the frame as we're setting this up now. And you know how we all are looking at Europe going back, dusting off its coal power plants, the same coal power plants that it was pushing all of us to phase out of just 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago at the COP26. And exactly as Chandrabhushan said earlier, where they always have an agenda when they come to these COPs, and they forced all of us to actually, phase coal, and we were all excited, and, we were getting on the bandwagon in terms of how important it is. And now it's so interesting where they say, look, this is a bitter pill to take, but winter is right around the corner and we need to take care of our own communities, etc. And I find this so ironic because this is exactly the perspective we as developing countries have been taking so far, where we say, give us the financial and the economic space to allow our countries to prosper, give us the space to be able to take care of the immediate needs of our people. But somehow that always never resonated in these conversations. So I'm finding it extremely ironic, as I said, at this situation, where now we're going into a COP where the exact same countries are now going to have to come up with an interesting way to frame their problem and look at solutions when they want to force us into further taking these COPs forward. While yes, there's a lot of important stuff that will be discussed, and I absolutely agree, we should not say that the work is done and this is going to be a run-of-the-mill operational COP. There's a lot that we can, if that's what we say, then basically we're admitting that we've lost the battle on actually getting more space for us to deliver on our climate ambition in line with our own national needs and our own space that we have at the moment in order to transition to these just economy, transition to cleaner economies. Within that frame, since I come with a background on climate finance, I would just like to focus on what mindset we should go with and what we should try to get out of it. And I would connect that a little bit to the loss and damage conversation. And I'll just wrap it up with what we can do outside these climate negotiations per se, in terms of what the formal agendas, where the formal agendas don't allow us the space, what is it that we can potentially do. So just very quickly, we all know that we're going into this COP trying to debate what that final magic number will look like. What is the quantum of climate finance that will start pouring in 2025 onwards? And we know that we have not been able, I mean, COP26, the countries, I think no matter how you count the climate finance, it was very clear that we have the developed countries who had promised the 100 billion have clearly failed. That number was not achieved. Therefore, it's important that when we start moving into setting up another number, we should be basing the future allocation or the quantification of climate finance, not just on the whims of pulling a number out of thin air as we did at Copenhagen in 2009 when the 100 billion figure was thrown around, but really to learn from these last 13 years in terms of what went wrong and what are the lessons we've learned, and start using that in our climate negotiations at COP27. So you wedge the conversation open in the text and in the discussion as it goes forward to the next COP. So this becomes a very important, crucial COP to ensure, from a climate finance perspective, to ensure that developing countries push and explain, look, here are the lessons. We're not speaking in, we're not just saying this number or that number, but we are actually basing it on some evidence over here. So, so a couple of things that we should all be clear of when we're going into these conversations. The first thing is, when we set up the convention, we clearly said that any commitment, financial commitment from the developed countries to the developing countries will be based on the needs of the countries. But it took us 30 years to actually come to a point and actually define what the needs are. And then last year, the COP actually, after a lot of give and take, decided to undertake a needs assessment, which is called the Needs Determination Report, the NDR, which was released last year. And if you put, what they did was they looked at all the NDC, the NAPs, the NAMAs, and everything that developing countries have put forth as their request for climate action, conditional, unconditional. And when they actually calculated all of this, what they realized was that only 30% of what we say we will do as climate action has been costed. So it's one thing is very clear, us developing countries need to do a better job of costing our needs. We'll put things in there, but we don't really take it to the point of saying, this is how much I will need. That's the dollar amount that I'm asking for, and that's the impact the dollar will have. So that's lesson number one. However, even if we just look at the 30%, just the 30% equals to anywhere between $5 to $11 trillion. Now let that sink in compared to the $100 billion that we're talking about, and you'll have developed countries when you go into COP. In fact, you'll be hearing it already where people will talk about doubling their current amounts. They'll talk about doubling. They'll talk about from the floor of the 100 billion. That sounds all very good, but look at the quantum that you're dealing with. So like in terms of what the needs are and in terms of what you're trying to achieve, this is something that we really need to push. And people are just not talking about this NDR report enough. And that's exactly what we should be forcing and pushing developed countries who actually want to put money in what that whole number should look like. It should not just be around, okay, the US has given $3 billion, of which, by the way, they've not even given the remaining 2, it's just 1 billion to the GCF. And if they say we'll double it, that's 6 billion. I mean, whoa, what's the starting point on that? So that's critical that we keep pushing as developing countries when we go into this COP, when we go into COP27, we primarily focus on not the starting point is not the 100 billion, the starting point is the needs of the developing countries, which now we've started shaping up into proper requirements. I will touch upon the obvious things as well, which is, first of all, we need to start defining what climate finance is. You know, it's the poor country's word versus the rich country's word. Is it grant financing? Is it loan? Is it the private sector? Is it the public sector? So the last 13 years, we've just been fighting over how to count the 100 billion. it's important to have a proper accounting methodology in place, and we should be able to provide certain ways in terms of how we do that. There is the very obvious conversation around this being new and additional, because, and this we're not just saying because we've been saying this earlier, but if we actually look at the numbers, what we realize is that in the last 13 years or so, where money has actually been moving of the existing amount, 61% of that is debt financing. So climate finance, 61% is actually going to countries who are already vulnerable to have to pay that money back to developed countries where they're already in debt-like situations and having to deal with lower credit rating, etc. That comes with the further burden that you're taking. So it's important, when we were talking about new and additional, when we were talking about grant financing, look at where we are right now when we were not taking that point seriously. 2/3 of the funding is actually going as debt to us, and that's money we're paying back to the developing countries. And the second part around, the third part around lessons from where we are is primarily the adaptation finance, right? We've all been hearing about the GGA. If you actually look at the numbers that UNEP has come up with, they're primarily saying that we'll need anywhere between US 155 to say 300 billion by 2030. Those are the sort of needs of the developing countries. So, I mean, again, I'm giving these numbers primarily to really draft a narrative which is around, look, this is what the numbers are. This is what the reality on ground is. Therefore, as we go forward, we need to be conscious of A, B, and C rather than just sort of, their word against our word and just sort of developing certain numbers that we see where we've landed in the last 13 years on this issue itself. And lastly, in terms of the lessons learned, I would just like to talk a little bit about the private sector. So the panacea that we've been fed over the last many years as developing countries is, look, we will put in the dollar and magic will happen. The private sector will come running. 1:10, 1:20 is leverage ratios we've been told about, which is we will do the first financing. You go and, open the private sector, and the international private sector will come running. The domestic private sector will be encouraged to put in money in these kinds of things. And again, if you look at the numbers, it's far from the truth. Another report by the CPI, which primarily looks at funding all climate finance, developing countries, they don't separate. So they've looked at that, and it's basically in the last year, in 2021, 49% comes from the private sector. Just 49%. What multiples are we talking about? And by the way, in the 49%, they've also calculated the electric cars that individuals like you and I have actually been purchasing over these years, whether it's cars or rickshaws or motors or whatever. So that's also counted in all of this. So you realize that the panacea that they keep telling us around how if we engage, if they give $1, that will actually lead to $10 by unlocking private sector finance, is not what we've seen in the past, and we don't see it happening in the future. Therefore, the conversation needs to focus on specificities over there. Lastly, moving on to the loss and damage part, at COP27, we're all aware of where countries like Pakistan, today it was Pakistan, yesterday it was another country, and unfortunately tomorrow will be yet another country facing exactly the same issues that Pakistan is where we're standing at the moment. And I think for the first time what has happened is that within the larger agenda, loss and damage was always seen as a technical issue where they were, for the last 10 years, they've been giving us the space, the technical space, the Warsaw International Mechanism. Countries sit and talk and tell us what you like. Do you think loss and damage is DRR? Do you think insurance companies should be part of this conversation? And we've just been going round and round in the circle for the last 10 years at least. But I think for the first time, what has happened now is that the loss and damage conversation has entered the climate finance conversation, where I think someone earlier mentioned as well, where Pakistan, as the chair of G77 at the SBI in June, requested for loss and damage finance to be part of the official agenda on the COP as well as the CMA, which is basically conversations that will have to now be had on climate, on loss and damage finance. And Pakistan is keen not just to lead on abstract conversation on loss and damage, but really looking at the design and the modalities, when it should trigger, how it should trigger, what should the money be for. So the ante is now going to be upped. And as I think some of the speakers before me said, that this needs to be a conversation, this needs to be a COP for loss and damage. That's an area that we can really build upon. So that's sort of my intervention on the agenda and the loss and damage, sorry, the agenda and COP27 itself. Just last parting thought would be around how about using the increasingly interesting space around the COP, which allows people to rally such interesting issues on the table, which are not on the formal agenda, but they get them through. So the case in point is the methane pledge. All of us remember how EU and the US led on it. And somehow it had, at the end of COP26, it had over 100 countries signing on to the methane pledge, where we all, I don't know, agreed to reduce emissions by 20%, 2030, or something dramatic like that. So point is, the space parallel to the COPs is becoming increasingly more interesting and increasingly more available to gather parallel conversations. In case of developing countries, why can't we start using this space to talk about debt restructuring, right? We saw it happen when the pandemic hit. We saw how, because of the pandemic, since everybody was being equally impacted and there was more sympathy, I believe, at that time, where loans were restructured. Why, again, a problem that you haven't created and you're having to pay for it, why can't we in parallel start talking about how we can also engage on debt restructuring where countries are hit by climate, the impacts of climate change, like the likes of what Pakistan had to deal with this summer. The conversation now needs to be integrated. You can't look at, we were very clear that the debt crisis is actually going to continue to be a chokehold on climate action for any country, rich or poor, right? More so. So if you want developing countries to start playing ball on some of the interesting climate action ideas that spew every COP, it's important that we start integrating the debt restructuring conversation together with the climate equity conversation. Thank you very much for your time, and happy to be a part of any questions or anything that will follow.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kakakil, for your very interesting and original remarks on climate finance. The need to focus not only on the quantity of finance, but also its quality, whether it is grant finance or concessional finance, or simply ordinary investment flows which operate according to market forces. And this interesting question, this new proposal, this idea of linking up the question of debt restructuring with climate finance. Thank you very much. I now call upon our final speaker, Ms. Ulka Kelka, Director Climate of the World Resources Institute, India. Ms. Ulka Kelka, she's dropped out.
So due to bad network, she's not here.
She's dropped out?
Yeah, I think she dropped out.
She's dropped out.
Oh,
okay.
I'm sorry, but for certain reasons, she's unable to join us today. So we conclude this section, the panel discussion with the presentation made by the last speaker, Ms. Kashmala Kakakil. Thank you.
So we have some time for question and answers. If Ambassador Dasgupta, if you want to go ahead with it, like with one round, maybe.
Yes, certainly. If there are any specific questions and answers, and if the speakers are still available, or maybe we can throw the floor open to those participants who are there with us still. Okay. So, any questions from the floor? No, I don't
So, Ambassador Dasgupta, there is one question: is why is loss and damage not a regular issue at the COP? So that's just one question that's come up. If you want to take that.
Sorry, what is the question?
Why is loss and damage not, discussed regularly and in substantive terms at the COP?
Okay, so here's the question. Any participants who'd care to take that on?
I'm happy to.
Yes. Ms. Kaka-Khel, please.
Thank you very much. The reality is embedded in the fact that for rich countries, developed countries, climate is all about mitigation, is all about forcing countries like ours to mitigate with our own finances, right? So if you look at the history of how the climate negotiations developed, you only heard mitigation for the first 10 years, starting from 1992. It was only in the early 2000s when we started talking about the fact that even if if hypothetically emissions were to come to zero today, the impacts would still be felt by countries all over, right? And that's where the conversation moved to adaptation. And so the 2000s were really the decade of people pushing on adaptation. And that's when countries realize that even if we are adapting, there is still residual impact that needs to be addressed. And that's where the conversation started picking up on loss and damage. And this is, if I look at, I mean, yes, you can, within the convention, it's enshrined where they talk about compensation, etc. But somehow that was lost over the years, right? And that's it took us until 2010 to really pick up the issue of loss and damage and say, despite mitigation, despite adaptation, we're having to deal with loss and damage. Therefore, we need to start talking about finances for loss and damage as well. We've been talking about finances for loss, mitigation, adaptation, but now while in parallel, we also need to talk about this. And it is a standing item in the sense where I mentioned in my intervention as well, is where they just want to talk about the technicality of it. They will give you space. They will allow you to meet every 3 times a year. And then that ExCom will come back and present its recommendations to the COP, where the COP will say, go ahead and do some more soul searching and do some more analysis and come back to us, basically buying time. But I think the reason why we gave into the phasing of the coal at COP26 was on the hope that what came out from that for the loss and damage was the Glasgow dialogue, that ultimately this Glasgow dialogue for loss and damage will result in a climate, in financing for loss and damage. Again, in Urdu, as we say, truck ki batti ki piche, laga diya hai, but at the same time, now that we have loss and damage finance in the formal agenda of the COP27, it will be really interesting to see how we collectively as South Asia, as G77, as like-minded developing countries can come together and put up a strong position on saying, look, enough is enough. It's important that we start looking at this holistically and not just strategically and operationally, not technically in terms of what the definition of loss and damage is. I hope that suffices.
Thank you very much. That was a very clear and comprehensive answer to the question. But while we still have you on the screen, may I put a question to Ms. Kaka-Khel? And it is this. I mean, you made some very telling points, very persuasive points regarding loss and damage, and also this question of debt restructuring. Now, without questioning those, the point is, as a practical matter, do you feel that Pakistan has more to gain from these lines of approach, or from putting greater emphasis on the question of adaptation finance? Because currently the adaptation sort of discussions in successive COPs focuses heavily on countries that are most heavily affected, namely low-lying island countries, certain LDCs and so on. And this is entirely understandable. I mean, there's no question that these countries deserve special treatment. But the fact remains that if we look not at the number of countries affected, but at the number of people affected, if we take a people-centric approach, the overwhelming majority of people, of poor people, who will have to bear the burden of climate impact, lie in low-lying deltaic regions, such as the Mekong, the Ganges-Brahmaputra, which includes Bangladesh, the Indus, which includes Pakistan, the Nile, which includes Egypt, the Amazon, which includes Brazil, and so on. So where would you put greater emphasis? I mean, we need common action on all these, but would you agree that on adaptation, there's a real need for countries in South Asia, and indeed other similarly situated countries, which are not necessarily sort of low-lying islands or LDCs, to press their rightful claims more energetically?
Sir, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. If I were to look at how Pakistan has been positioning itself and reflecting the reality on ground in these negotiations. So back in 2010, 10-11, at these COPs, it was interesting because the word vulnerable was being defined. And in terms of defining the word vulnerable, it was being brought down to LDCs and SIDS, exactly as you mentioned, which is specific countries lying in specific economic bands within the larger global context that we've set for ourselves. And at the same time, in the same breath, you will have the reports of German Watch and others where they will say Pakistan is the 6th or the 7th most vulnerable country. And we couldn't wrap our head around the fact that you're reducing the definition, and then you're basically removing Pakistan from and the likes. You mentioned Egypt as well. You are actually defining the eligibility criteria for the international finance that's available for adaptation. This was before loss and damage became an issue. And sir, absolutely 100%. If you are able to adapt well, your losses will be lesser. So that is an area we're definitely focusing on. In fact, I will push it even more, where I will say we need, and I keep, even in Pakistan, keep explaining to people how we should not look at this as a threat, but really as an opportunity. If there is a global transition to cleaner energy, notwithstanding what Germany has done with its coal power plants, and they're telling us it's temporary. Let's hope that's what it is. But mitigation money, right? Concessional financing, which we should be pushing for, is an opportunity that Pakistan and India and others, and I've seen your NDC, where you've committed to 50% of solar energy by 2030, subject to financing, right? Subject to concessional financing, if I were to be particular. So India already, countries, we are aware of the fact that we should not just, yes, adaptation, loss and damage, absolutely critical, but upstream as well. Should there be concessional financing, which we need to push for at these negotiations, will allow us the fiscal space to also mitigate, not just that we're reducing the GHG emissions, but at the same time, the co-benefit is that we're having cheaper solutions available in terms of the energy that we demand for our own economic growth at the country level.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
So there's just one question I'd like to take from the chat, Ambassador Dasgupta.
Yes.
This question, I think, perhaps could be posed to Mr. Bagai, in terms of, if there are any examples that relate to lifestyles and adaptation, the life movement of India and adaptation.
Yes,
He's there.
He's there. Yes, please. I'd be grateful if you could take that question.
Shelley, offhand, it may be a little difficult to think of an example of adaptation and individual behavior. But I think Param highlighted a few of those issues. And I think a very good inventory of such small steps has been collated by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. In fact, the ex-Forest Ministry of Environment Minister, Dr. Harshvardhan, made this very popular by introducing his green steps, the 500 green steps which he collected. But certainly, I think if you're looking at very specific agriculture or a eco-DRR area, there are certain steps at a Gram Panchayat level by individuals that could certainly be a contributor to life. And as is also being said, and the Prime Minister highlighted that issue, that if 1.3 billion people take small steps on a daily basis, it can collect into a huge carbon emission reduction. But I think I would also like to highlight the point that Dubash raised, meaning while individual behavior can be seen as something which will be voluntary, and in many cases it's also looked upon as government trying to shift the burden to individual action. I think a successful program like a behavioral change, and why nudges do become possible, would depend a lot on the ambience that is created in terms of ecosystems or infrastructures or technologies or alternatives around that for the individual action to be successful. We tried this, for example, under the Montreal Protocol, where Ms. Negi also was talking about Kigali Amendment, and when Kigali Amendment was being negotiated, there was a lot of talk going around on buying green air conditioners, which were not dependent on harmful gases. And instead of focusing right in the beginning, because the negotiations were taking a long time, it took almost 7 years, and the technologies were not being shared, the individual action of buying green air conditioners was emphasized quite a lot, that consumer behavior would lead to technology changes by the manufacturers. So I think it can work both ways, but I think a good kind of a ecosystem would be needed for a program like LIFE to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagai, for that, for taking that question and giving such a clear and specific answer to it. I feel we've run out of time now. That brings this session to a close. Our panel discussion is now over, and we go on to the last act of today's program.
Thank you very much, sir. All that it actually remains for me to say is that we must reconvene again. This has been one of the most fascinating discussions, candid, frank, and let me also say substantive on all elements. We had a presentation on something which India is embarking upon as a major mass movement in the country, lifestyles. But we also had a very substantive discussion on the COP. And I must, mention that Atul is an old friend of mine. We were both together in Bonn, where this issue of what's going to happen at Sharm el-Sheikh was generally the talk of the town, as they say. I want to leave just one thought with all of you here. Location does matter. And I'm not talking about Sharm el-Sheikh and the way it is located, but the fact that the COP is taking place in Africa, that there is a certain impetus to that. So what Archana Negi and many of the others refer to are important elements. I mean, let's not forget that unlike some of the other environmental negotiations, and this includes the Montreal Protocol, which I understand that people have very little, let me say, other examples to cite. So they have to cite something which is very specific and very limited in that sense, where somebody could turn around and say, I'll pay you for everything that you do. You think it is possible in the context of carbon? No, it isn't. Therefore, those kind of examples get cited. But I think fundamentally there needs to be a better understanding that climate change, which may have begun, or the idea may have been seeded in a particular manner, is now perhaps the most important global strategic negotiation that is taking place. Ambassador Dasgupta was there in 1992. If many people recall, it wasn't a UNFCCC conference. The convention didn't exist. It was a conference under the UN's auspices. We have at a number of times seen that the executive secretary is almost missing. And there are very good reasons for it. It's the nature of what this means, this entire business of, carbon driving our situations, the need for adaptation, and every single one of them. I want to also especially say that I'm very happy to see you, Ms. Kaka Kale, here, along with my friends Navroz Dubash. Navroz, are you still in Singapore? And Chandra Bhushan, who's extremely prescient on several of these subjects and was very clear in what we need to do in terms of the global negotiation. But Ms. Kaka Kale, your presence was important, certainly because of the very important points that you made. But let me say something else, because you represent, not in the sense of the government, but the country which chairs the G77. Let me tell you, I have had many an occasion for Pakistan to be chairing the G77 and for me to be in the delegation. If I recall right, it was Bali, where both Ambassador Dasgupta and I were here, and Ambassador Munir Akram was chairing that. I think in India, many times people fail to understand one of the elements. Let's leave aside the politics, the bilateral issues, because those are dime a dozen, and I don't want to go into them either in the context of India-Pakistan or in the context of the COP in Africa, because that's a wholly different ballgame, and in my opinion, perhaps a more important ballgame than of the discussions that have taken place. But I do want to say that the understanding of countries which chair these particular things, especially a group of 77, their understanding of where they are in the scheme of play in the world, their understanding of being a nation state are extremely important. And which is why when we talk about bringing South Asia together, it's usually, so it was also in the chair in 1992. There you are, the starting point of it all. Thank you very much, sir, for telling me. So, there's a hell of a lot to it. The point that I want to make is, what all of this does is, even within South Asia, we need to understand that it's perhaps easier for us to talk in terms of cogency of voices, because it is the way the countries think of themselves and the way they present themselves, which is why, I'm perhaps stepping completely out of tune here by saying that actually the India-Pakistan partnership in the G77 is the strongest in these matters. Let's leave the others aside. I've handled all of that. That's a different matter altogether. The reason is, it's the thinking perception of who you are. You mentioned that you are the 6th or 7th most vulnerable country in the world. And the fact of the matter is that you are going to be among the larger societies and larger economies in the world, no matter the current set of problems that you're currently facing as an economy. These are things that need to be understood, even including among us. But the reality is, from 1992, when the stalwarts, Ambassador Dasgupta being one of those in the lead, you could get all those articles like Article 4, etc. Come on, the world has changed. And what has changed in the world? Let me be very honest. What has really changed in the world is 10 years later, a chap called Jim O'Neill discovered the brick. I'm afraid that has put Pakistan on the spot, but it has put all of us perhaps in a greater spot and put the developed world in perhaps the biggest spot of them. They perhaps knew it, we didn't, but it's now in our consciousness. And this is going to remain, perhaps without doubt, the most important things. You mentioned about loss and damage, etc. Why is it that Pakistan, including India, were not in favor of it? Because you know what the net result is. The net result is not going to be, madam, no matter what you say. Something that somebody mentioned here, I think it was Navroz who mentioned this thing about sword and the shield. The foolhardy also bear the sword. But if you don't have the shield, as the other fellows who only come in an armored suit, it doesn't work to your advantage, especially depending upon who you are and how big a sword that you have and your carrying capacity. They are particularly important elements. And I think for the large number of countries in the world and the larger developing countries, and I take you back to the point made by Ambassador Dasgupta, the question of peoples. Where are the people? And this particular understanding is certainly going to be germane, in fact, in the way we are perhaps going to see the world change in the next 15, 20 years. It's not just for nothing that we are talking about global balance shifting towards the Asian continent, Indo-Pacific, etc., etc. It isn't just for nothing that people are talking in terms of where the great growth rates are going to happen, which are the countries which are going to be in the top numbers. If all of you don't mind my saying so, not just are we going to become India, the largest country in the world in terms of population, in South Asia already is that, if you look at it as a subcontinent in the world. When we look at the 4 or 5 largest economies in the world, in the year 2050, the 3 largest economies in the world will not include a single European country. Already, the chances of them being in the top 4 are very minuscule. These are the realities of life. And these are not realities which can be escaped in terms of the negotiations which we are carrying out, because these negotiations, and I fully appreciate the question of adaptation, the question of loss and damage, the question of resilience, all of them. But fundamentally, we are talking not just of individual behavior, it will follow, but we are talking about the way we've lived and run our life. Because that one thing which powered life for 5 or 10 generations before us and made us, do this virtual conferencing, etc., etc. Perhaps the fuel for that will have to be something else. I don't know the answers, but I do believe that the human mind and technology and innovation, not just eat less, do less, run more, sit on bullock carts, no. Technology is by far, in my personal opinion, the answer. We just need to think much more. And if you notice one thing, the one area that we really don't focus on in these negotiations or even at the UN is anything to do with technology. I understand finance because, it's a matter of cutting a check and somebody can make a total of all of that. But if you look at technologies and what is possible, and can the human mind find a way of looking at another fuel, another way of harnessing even the current fuel? I don't know the answers. I'm not sanguine, but I'm not unhopeful. I'm sure all of us together will do so. To TERI, I want to say a big thank you. On behalf of both Ambassador Dasgupta and myself, and we both have the honor of serving this institution, Shelley and her team, Anuradha, Nivedita. Atul, thank you for always supporting us. Archana, thank you. Navroz, where are you? I can't see you anymore. Chandrabhushan ji, Ms. Kaka Khel, good to see you here also. All I want to tell everyone is, I can't say do it again before the COPs, it's too soon. But after that, we will try and bring this kind of a panel together, because I think it's a good idea for us to have a candid and fair discussion on where we are. Because no matter what we are saying about Sharm el-Sheikh, let me tell you, the COP in the UAE will not be one of just standing and watching. It will be a moving and shaking COP, no matter the other issues in the world, given several other factors which are facts in terms of the global political agenda. Let me stop here. Thank you very, very much to all of you. Young lady, the anchor, the screen is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for such an insightful discussion.
We are over. We can all sign off. Thank you.